All right, I'd like to call this meeting of your Newark City Council to order. Autumn, please call the roll.
Mr. Labutus?
Present.
1 second.
It's hard to get good help.
Oh, Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Present.
Mr. Rath?
Here.
Mr. Blake?
Here.
Mr. Bubb?
Here.
Mr. Koss?
Here.
Mr. Fennell?
Here.
Mr. Frazier?
Here.
And Ms. Hall?
Here.
We have all here this evening. Next, we have the invocation by Mr. Blake, followed by the pledge of allegiance. Please rise.
May you bow your heads. Precious Lord, we welcome you into this space. Guide us with your wisdom. Give us strength to make decisions on behalf of the people of Newark, and allow us to make those decisions with goodwill. We ask all these things in your name. Amen.
William, you want to lead the pledge for us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, William. Mr. Blake. Next on the agenda this evening, we have caucus. That's the time for council to discuss anything pertaining to the agenda tonight. Do we have anything?
Mr. President,
Mr. Mark.
we will be invoking Rule 11 on legislation that needs to be expedited.
And Mr. Sasson,
Yes, sir.
did you want to add anything to that?
No, these are the same pieces of legislation that were considered in Service Committee tonight. They need to be addressed tonight to meet a statutorily imposed deadline. They could be handled in caucus or miscellaneous. That's your choice.
Okay, thank you. We'll just do it in miscellaneous, if that's okay, Mr. Mark. Basically, we have to do this because the deadline is so many days, and we'll maybe pass that if we don't do it.
Correct.
Thank you. Next, we have the minutes of our July 2nd, 2018 meeting. Is there a motion to approve those? Motion. Motion by Mr. Labutus.
Second.
Second by Mr. Frazier. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That passes. Thank you. Next, under appointments, we have the appointments of 3 folks for our Assessment Equalization Board. One is Carol Floyd, one is Rhonda Loomis, and one is Roy Bennett. Mr. Sasson, do you want to chip in on that just for a second about why we're doing that?
If you recall, the Assessment Equalization Board is designed to address objections that have been received from the residents in the Fairway Estates area with regard to the sewer improvement assessment that was recently considered by council, pending before council, tabled at the last meeting. That board will be empowered to hear those appeals, report back to council, and we'll proceed accordingly.
Thank you. I just picked 3 folks that had nothing to do with that. Was my Mr. Sasson charged me to do that, so I just picked these 3 folks. So all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Abstain.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bowden. That was an abstain by Mr. Bowden. Okay, reports of standing committees. We have 2 this evening, one from finance and one from safety. Without objection, those will be received and filed. Reports from city officials, we also have 2. One from Stephen Johnson, our auditor, the operating report for the period ending June 30th, 2018, and Barb Jobes, our city income tax administrator, income tax revenue report for the period ending June 30th, 2018. Without objection, those will be received and filed. And under communications, we have 2 this evening, one from Michelle Smith and one from the Ohio State University. Both of those, without objection, will be received and filed. Next on the agenda this evening, we have comments from citizens. That's a time for you to be heard. This is not a debate with council, but this gives you an opportunity. Is there anyone who'd like to speak this first section?
I would like to speak.
Anyone else this first section? William? Okay. If you could just give us your name and address for the record, please.
It's Dave Froelich, and I got to try to remember my address because we don't have furniture in there yet, but I think it's 648 Woods Edge Lane in Newark.
Okay.
Okay. I have, my memory isn't good as it used to be, so I have prepared remarks that I'll read from, and if you'll indulge me for 7 or 8 minutes, I'll get through this, and we won't have to do it twice in another meeting. So, first, I'd like to compliment the mayor and his administration for the fantastic job in transforming downtown Newark and the other positive changes they have made. Mr. Mayor, you have my vote in the next election, despite what you might conclude by the time I finish. The following statements concerning Don Edwards Park are mine alone, even though I believe most, if not all, of our committee are of a similar opinion. Adam Jenkins, in particular, along with Director Rhodes, have done an outstanding job for the last year and a half at Edwards Park. And my comments have nothing to do with the condition of Edwards Park, and everything to do with generating several $100,000 to help ensure the future of Don Edwards Park. Recently, a proposal was submitted by Jim Folk and the Licking County Settlers to lease Edwards Park for 10 years and generate the funds I just described. The following distinguished community leaders were members of the committee, and they viewed the Settlers' proposal as an overwhelming benefit to the taxpayers and a no-brain decision to the city fathers. They consist of Jim Cooper, respected attorney, Paul Thompson, president of First Federal, Gary Walters, clerk of court, Noble Snow, CPA, Wilson, Shannon, and Snow, Pat Jeffries, retired State Farm executive, Doug Pricer, president of WCLT, Mike Massaro, retired president of Tectum, and Matt Miller, executive VP at Park National Bank. Interestingly, 5 of the above are former YMCA board chairmen, and 3 are current Y board members. Now, here were the proposed benefits to our community. The Settlers would install a $200,000 artificial turf infield at Edwards Park with 0 cost to the city of Newark. Second, the Settlers would reduce the annual management fee currently paid by the city to the YMCA from $48,000 to $30,000 annually, a taxpayer saving of $180,000 over the lease term. Third, the Settlers would reinvest 70% of all profits back into Edwards Park. That's estimated to be $200,000 to $280,000 over the lease term. The savings will result from the artificial turf, volunteer labor, and the elimination of nearly $80,000 of YMCA expenses for national dues, contributions to retirement plans, health insurance premiums, and associated payroll taxes. Fourth, the Settlers would construct 2 Little League fields. I don't know what that costs, $25,000, $50,000, whatever it is. It would be no cost to the city of Newark. All in, it's $600,000 to $700,000. So what plans does the city have to fund this depreciating asset, Edwards Park? I've been told by city officials that no monies will be available from the general fund, and the bed tax is very limited. So with a change in administrations or a downturn in the economy, how will this facility survive? Concerned about the potential downside, I asked a well-respected community leader who you all know, what happens if the Settlers fail? The unexpected answer was, why do you care? Why do you care if Newark ends up with artificial turf at no cost to the city? Next, the proposal was run past 2 city councilmen. One stated, isn't it enough that the YMCA agreed to do this? The answer is no. The second one said, it's working now. Why would we change? Well, I don't know, $500,000, $600,000, whatever the number turns out to be. What's it take to get your attention, councilman? These are not the thoughtful responses one expects from the stewards of our economy. On May 11th, the proposal was presented to Mayor Hall, Director Rhodes, and Councilman Cost. Also present were 7 members of the committee mentioned above and 3 members of the Settlers Organization. We received the following responses as to why the proposal was not feasible. First, I could get sued personally if the Settlers go bankrupt. Second, the city could no longer continue to pay all the utilities and trash collection, grass cutting, gasoline expenses, that the city has paid for the past 7 years at Edwards Park. The reason given was because it would be inconsistent with that of the ice arena. How absurd. And we heard the city cannot enter into an agreement that splits profits. Anybody ever heard that one before? I hadn't. I called the Attorney General's office to see if such a law existed. Of course it did not. Director Rhodes was probably concerned about how to track the split. The Columbus attorney then asked, well, how do you split the profits now? The answer is, they're not. All profits are retained by the YMCA. The attorney then said, so what's the downside? Why would the city continue to provide significant tax dollars into a venue and not provide the taxpayer the opportunity to share in any profits? Fourth reason given is we might have to do an RFP. Now, you know what that means, and I think that's political speak for let's put it out for bid. Why that would be considered a reason, I have no idea. These are not valid reasons, but trumped up excuses to maintain the status quo. But why? Why would that be? Other reasons I heard along the way that were not germane or exaggerations or just plain not true. We're going to show movies, have soccer, flag football, and lacrosse. I'm not sure what this has to do with saving the taxpayers $600,000 or $700,000. Then we heard the two Little League fields would compete with North Newark Little League and Mound City. Clearly, anybody that knows anything about the game knows that there's a difference between what they play at North Newark and Mound City. It's called rec ball, recreation ball. It has nothing to do with travel baseball, which would be played on the Little League fields at Edwards Park. They don't even allow travel baseball there, and they certainly wouldn't come there to play it. The YMCA, then we heard, has increased games from 200 to 700. Let me tell you, this is a gross exaggeration. If you think about that for a second, there are 4 diamonds, and you do a little quick division over the 14 weeks that the park was open, that only works out to be 3.5 games a week. Why would you need 4 fields? That's no games in the park on Monday, no games on Tuesday, no games on Wednesday, a game every other Thursday, and single games on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Never a doubleheader and never a night game. 200 games? When are we talking about? 1982? So why were Director Rhodes and others so determined to maintain the status quo? Several members of our committee are old enough to remember the demise of a minor league park located on Y property and operated by the YMCA. And we want to ensure a better outcome for Edwards Park. In conclusion, the settlers have submitted a bid on another venue. They have moved on, and this opportunity is now lost. But why was this proposal supported by this stellar group of individuals not given objective consideration, which it wasn't? At best, this is an irresponsible blunder, and those involved should be both embarrassed and ashamed. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you. And I'd just like to add, I've known you a long time. I'd just like to thank you for all the work you've done over the years at Babe Ruth and Edwards Field, because I know how much you put into that. So thank you. William? Anyone else this first section? If you raise your hand.
But you're 263 Union Street. There's one thing I'd like to know. When is Union Street going to get paved? And the reason why I ask, my street has never been paved, not for a long, long time. I think it's by a high time. at the city of Newark, it's about high time that the Union Street should be paved. But I'm pass.
Thank you, Wayne. Next, we're going to move on to resolutions on the second reading, 18-52.
Resolution 18-52 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Goss, Mr. Marmee. A resolution authorizing and directing the Director of Public Safety for the City of Newark, Ohio to release the lien previously placed against the property located at and known as 444 Woods Avenue, Newark, Ohio.
You've heard the second reading of 18-52. What is your wish?
Mr. President.
Mr. Rath.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt 18-52.
Motion by Mr. Rath, second by Mr. Frazier. Is there any discussion on 18-52? Seeing none, Autumn, please call the roll vote.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Koss,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
yes,
18-52 passes 10-0. Next on the second reading, we have 18-53.
Resolution 18-53 by Mr. Lang, Mr. Koss, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Rath, Mr. Frazier. A resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
You've heard the second reading of 18-53. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Lang.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt Resolution 18-53.
Motion by Mr. Lang, second by Mr. Frazier. Is there any discussion on 18-53? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Koss,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
yes,
18-53 passes 10-0. Next, we move on to resolutions on the first reading, 18-54.
Resolution 18-54 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Lang, Mr. Koss, Mr. Rath, and Mr. Frazier. A resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
18-54.
President?
Mr. Marmee.
Need to make a motion to waive the 2-day reading rule on 18-54.
Motion by Mr. Marmee to waive the 2-day reading rule. Second. Second by Mr. Frazier. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have some things that need to be expedited, including payouts.
Thank you, Mr. Marmee. Autumn, please call the roll and waive the 2-day reading rule.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Koss,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
yes,
2-day reading rule is waived. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Make a motion to adopt Resolution 18-54.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Marmee.
Second.
Second by Mr. Frazier. Is there any discussion on 18-54? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Koss,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
yes,
18-54 passes 10-0. And finally tonight, we have 18-55.
Resolution 18-55 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Lang, Mr. Koss, Mr. Rath, Mr. Frazier. A resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
18-55 is on the first reading, and it will be held for 2 weeks until our next meeting. And that concludes our legislation this evening. Next is our second opportunity from comments from citizens. Do we have anyone? Ma'am? Do we have anybody else like to speak? Anybody else?
My name's Laura Canby. My address is 1120 Wintermute Avenue, and I'm addressing the gazebo again. You are starting to reconstruct it, and I'd appreciate it if you would put it back where it belongs and fix your mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Mr. Crowder?
Daniel Crawford, 163 South 2nd Street. I originally didn't plan on speaking today, but after the committee meetings, I had told Councilman Lang that I wanted to speak out in favor of the legislation that he proposed. It took me a little bit of time sitting and listening to what was being discussed, but as a citizen who voted in 2006 in favor of the smoking ban, and as an asthmatic, as well as the father of basically 2 asthmatics, this definitely concerns me, and I like to personally err on the side of caution, and just, you know, in any public places, that type of stuff just doesn't belong. I had a few more thoughts. I'm supportive of any kind of job creation in the city, especially if it advances one's ability to provide for their family. So if this annexation enables the creation of jobs that are especially living wage jobs, I'm all for it. Of course, I prefer that be the case, but if this is just to create like a few part-time jobs, I don't see it really as a net benefit for the people of Newark. But then again, I'll hold off all judgment until we see how that develops. And last things I'd like to say, today has been a remarkable day in some respects for any American citizen. And I know this body doesn't, advance non-binding resolutions. And in the past, I've had a history for, advocating for the impeachment of one president or another. Actually, of both parties, everyone here should remember. So I'm not going to waste my time in presenting a case over time here for that with respect to Trump, although I can absolutely make a case if I try to go about that. But I would just like all of us to just remember today as citizens for what seemingly happened. So just reflect on that, all of us, and we really should take some time to look at that and contact our members of Congress, because I'm personally deeply concerned about the state of our union in a lot of ways. Everyone here should know that I'm very vocal about that at times, but I could waste the time to type up a resolution for everyone here to consider, but it won't go anywhere. So just want to state that publicly, especially on the day that this happened. So with that, hope everyone has a good one.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Anyone from administration this evening? Honorable Law Director.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll pass.
Mayor Hall.
We've got Slice Lincoln County coming up on Friday night, and I think all the tables are sold, but there are individual tickets left, and it's usually a pretty good night and a pretty busy thing. And it'll be kind of a twofer, so there's farmers market just kind of prior to that, overlapping by 1 hour. So if you have nothing to do on Friday night, I encourage you to join it. Other than that, pass.
And let's hope for no rain.
And hope for no rain, yeah.
Mr. Levitas.
Mr. President, I will pass this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Levitas. Mr. Lang.
I'd just like to thank Mr. Crawford for speaking on behalf of, in support of 18-22. Thank you, appreciate it. That I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Mr. Marmon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll go ahead and bring forward the legislation Rule 11.
Okay. And Mr. Marmon, you and Mr. Gospel have decided we can use Rule 11. So Autumn, why don't you go ahead and read 18-20.
Ordinance 18-20 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Koss, Mr. Marmee, an ordinance consenting to the annexation of certain territory generally described as being approximately 0.53 acres more or less located in Newton Township to the city of Newark, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
So the reading of 18-20, which is an emergency, what is your wish?
Mr. President, make a motion to adopt ordinance 1820.
Motion by Mr. Marmon. Second by Mr. Koss. Is there any discussion on 18-20? Seeing none, I'll please call the roll vote.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Koss?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
Yes.
18-20 passes 10-0. Next we have 18-21.
Ordinance 18-21 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Koss, Mr. Marmee, an ordinance objecting to the annexation of certain territory generally described as being 0.53 acres, more or less, located in Newton Township to the city of Newark, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
Third reading of 18-21, which is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
make a motion to adopt ordinance 1821.
Motion by Mr. Marmee. Second by Mr. Koss. I'm sorry.
This is objecting, and we just passed one accepting.
This is the
Oh, that's right. This is the one we have
objection,
to...
this is the one you want to vote now.
Right.
Yeah, we just accept,
Yeah,
we just
forgot
accepted
about that
this
for a
one.
moment there. This is the legislation objecting. We just passed the one passing.
Given the passage of 18-20, 1821 is essentially rendered moot. They both can't pass.
Right.
So there is a motion pending. There can be a vote on it. It just simply needs to be rejected by the majority of council.
Okay. So we can either go ahead and vote, see how that goes, or we can just...
We have a first and a second.
Send it. So we'll just go ahead and vote. I'll please call the roll.
Okay.
Go.
Mr. Labutus?
No.
Mr. Lang?
No.
Mr. Marmee?
No.
Mr. Rath?
No.
Mr. Blake?
No.
Mr. Bub?
No.
Mr. Cost?
No.
Mr. Fennell?
No.
Mr. Frazier?
No.
And Ms. Hall?
No.
So 18-21 does not get approved. Next, we have 18-59.
Resolution 18-59 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, a resolution adopting a statement indicating what services, if any, the city of Newark, Ohio will provide for approximately .53 acres more or less located in Newton Township, a territory proposed for expedited to annexation and declaring an emergency.
Okay, we've heard the reading of 18-59, which is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
make a motion to adopt Resolution 18-59.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mr. Cost. Is there any discussion on 18-59? Seeing none, on please call the roll.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Cost?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
Yes.
18-59 passes 10-0. And finally, under our Rule 11 this evening, we have 18-60.
Resolution 18-60 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Cost, Mr. Marmee, a resolution regarding a buffer zone for the annexation of approximately .53 acres more or less located in Newton Township to the city of Newark and declaring an emergency.
You've heard the reading of 18-60. It is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
make a motion to adopt Resolution 18-60.
Motion by Mr. Marmee, second by Mr. Cost. Is there any discussion on 18-60? Seeing none, on please call the roll vote.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Cost?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes.
And Ms. Hall?
18-60 passes 10-0. Thank you for bearing with me. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you. With that, I will pass.
Thank you, Mr. Marmee. Mr. Rath?
I think I'd like to call a service committee meeting, and with that, I would also like to call a finance committee meeting, and then I will pass.
Thank you, Mr. Rath. Thank you, Mr. Marmee. Thank you. Mr. Blake.
Yield, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Mr. Buck.
I will pass.
Thank you, Mr. Buck. Mr. Cost. I will pass. Thank you. Mr. Cost. Mr. Fennell.
I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. And Ms. Hall. Oh, no, wait, we forgot one.
Oh, Mr. President, thank you.
So close. Motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
What is it, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Is that what it is?
2.5.
Two and a half minutes. Okay, thank you. I just want to say congratulations on another successful Jazz and Rib Fest and 31 West for their Rolling Stones tribute. I also want to make the announcement of the Community Development Block Grant app for 2018 that's due August 17th with $60,000 reserved for economic development and $20,000 reserved for community development. I also wanted to say thank you for everybody that participated in the HHCA picnic in the park on July 14th. I also want to thank the service director for getting a crew out there tomorrow to clean up the equipment that was damaged in a windstorm. And that will really add alleviate some safety concerns that we have there. Also, I wanted to thank the administration on the Church Street progress and the paving that is pending, as well as the other park progress that's going on in Wells and Flory and Everett. And with that, I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Ms. Hall.
Mr. President,
Thank you, Mark.
can I just correct something so folks realize? It's a 2019
2019, I apologize.
CDBG.
Ms. Hall.
Thank you, I will pass.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Okay. So I just have a couple of odds and ends. Our next meeting will be 3 weeks from tonight, because July is a 5-Monday month. It will be August 6th, again with committees starting at 5:45 and council starting at 7 o'clock. Thank you for attending tonight. We appreciate you coming. So a motion to adjourn. Motion by Mr. Cost, second by Mr. Booth. All in favor, signify by saying aye. Opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.